Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling anxiety and kind of like the sticky web of habits that we all get, tangled up in.
Yeah, how to break free, right?
Right, exactly. We are zeroing in on some stuff that you, our listener, have brought to us, some really cool sources. And we're going to try to extract the most valuable insights, the big takeaways that can help you understand your own experience with these things and how you can potentially make some changes, like actually make some changes that stick, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And I think our primary source for this deep dive, this exploration, is Judson Brewer's really insightful book, Unwinding Anxiety.
Mm.
I think the subtitle really nails it. It's New Science Shows How to Break the Cycles of Worry and Fear to Heal Your Mind.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be digging into his core principles and practical strategies, and hopefully it'll be a nice, quick, and dirty way for you to get the core of what anxiety is, how habit formation works, and how you can work with it.
Exactly. I mean, you've given us these sources, and I think it's a pretty safe bet that you're looking for a deeper understanding of your own, struggles with anxiety and probably some practical ways to address those habits, those things that that aren't serving you, the ones you want to kind of kick to the curb. So we're aiming for those aha moments, those moments where things just suddenly click into place without overwhelming you with detail.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So what I think one of the things that is really compelling in this book, Unwinding Anxiety, is a way that the author's understanding of anxiety wasn't just, academic.
Right.
It really started with his own personal experiences.
Yeah.
So he starts by talking about, his work with patients struggling with addiction. He was in residency at the time, and he started to notice some surprising things.
Yeah.
Started to notice the way that people were describing their cravings and that stuck feeling, that clinging.
Right.
It actually reminded him of things he'd been encountering in his own mindfulness practice.
It's that unexpected overlap, right?
Totally.
You've got addiction on one hand, you've got anxiety on the other hand. It's like, wait a minute, could there be this shared root in how our emotions work, even how our brains are wired?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, during residency, of course, you're sleep deprived, you're under huge pressure. He started having his own panic attacks.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
So this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
So most people, you go to the doctor, you have a panic attack, they might give you, medication. But he already had this mindfulness practice.
Mm-hmm.
And he found that he could actually go through, these full-blown panic attacks. And crucially, not get stuck in this fear of having more panic attacks.
Right. That's secondary anxiety. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what prevented this whole loop of panic or anxiety about anxiety.
Right.
So that's when he realized, oh, I can teach this.
I can teach this instead of just, prescribing medications. And he found that these skills could be taught. And they could offer people a really, really different path.
And I think that highlights this less is more idea that he talks about a lot in this book. That as he started paying closer attention to his patients and to his own internal experience, these really complex concepts around habit change, started to become clearer.
Yeah.
But as a scientist, I mean, you got to see the data.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah. You got to see the evidence.
You got to see the evidence.
And he did. And he was, quite struck by the evidence that he started gathering.
Yeah.
So, he talks about the initial clinical trial that he was involved in that was focused on smoking cessation. And they saw a 5 times higher quit rate compared to the gold standard approaches that were being used.
Wow. Huge difference.
Yeah, huge difference. And, he didn't stop there. He started, exploring, okay, how can we use smartphones, these devices that can be quite stressful in and of themselves.
Right.
But how can we use these devices to actually deliver these mindfulness-based tools?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the results were pretty stunning. 40% reduction in craving-related eating, 63% reduction in anxiety for people with generalized anxiety disorder, the full-blown diagnosed anxiety. They even started to see positive changes in anxious doctors.
Yeah, there was a study just on doctors, right,
Yeah.
who are, notoriously resistant to any kind of treatment.
Totally.
And the fact that they were able to even target specific brain networks that are involved in smoking with an app. I mean, that really underscores the practical power of these ideas.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So this idea of anxiety being like a shapeshifter, what does that mean for you, the listener? Like, how does anxiety show up in unexpected ways?
So the author shares this really relatable story, I think, from before he even went to medical school.
Mm-hmm.
And, he was seemingly very healthy. He's active. But he started experiencing all this really bad bloating and stomach cramps.
Mm.
And his first thought was, well, this can't be stress.
Right.
This can't be anxiety. He was just in denial of the possibility that anxiety could be manifesting in this way.
Mm.
So he immediately, jumps to a more tangible explanation, right? It's got to be Giardia.
Right. Something he can point to, right?
Yeah. It must be this parasitic infection I picked up, when I was backpacking through South America.
There's that story about him trying to convince the doctor that it has to be Giardia, even though the doctor was skeptical.
Yeah.
And even when the doctor prescribed antibiotics for this, unlikely infection, the symptoms just persisted until he finally acknowledged the role of stress.
Right.
So it really illustrates how easily our minds can either misinterpret or even just totally deny those bodily signals of anxiety.
Yeah.
And that anxiety can show up in these really unexpected pphysical ways. It's not always that clear fight or flight response, right?
Right.
It can be these weird things like digestive issues.
Yeah. And as the author's wife, Mari, she describes generalized anxiety, this feeling of kind of this low-grade feeling that has no object in itself.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the mind is just looking for something to latch onto. It's like a hidden current
Right.
that is just influencing all these seemingly unrelated things.
I like that metaphor of the anxiety being like a wildfire. It starts small and then it's fueled by these everyday experiences. It's like it really highlights how easily these diffuse feelings, like, they can just suddenly escalate. And it points to the difficulty, in diagnosing anxiety, even for professionals, let alone Dr. Google. Mm. So, the key takeaway here seems to be that that understanding how anxiety shows up for you individually, for you, the listener, is kind of a critical first step.
Yeah, absolutely. And because if you don't, recognize these many forms that it can take, then you might get caught up in these temporary distractions or these, short-term fixes that actually feed the anxiety in the long run. For you're not really dealing with the root of the problem.
Right. You're just kind of slapping a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah. And that's how we develop these unhelpful habits.
Right. Like the stress eating or the endless, scrolling.
Yeah, totally.
That kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Or maybe even getting stuck in this loop of trying to figure out why you're anxious, like, as if you're going to, cure it by figuring out why.
Totally.
Which kind of brings us to the modern anxiety landscape. And it's not exactly a new thing, is it? I mean, this quote from Thomas Jefferson way back in 1816, he talks about the evils which have never happened.
Right.
That's a pretty timeless observation about the nature of worry, I think.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
It's amazing, that even back then, people were really grappling with this tendency to project into the future and fear, potential negative outcomes.
Right.
And when we look at, more recent data, things like the EPA polls that have been done,
right.
The specific sources of our worries might have shifted. So now we're worried about health, we're worried about safety, finances, politics, relationships.
Right.
But the underlying experience of anxiety is still, a significant part of being human.
Right. It's like the flavor of the anxiety changes, but it's the same feeling underneath.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that, that 2017 survey finding that, a majority of Americans, even before the pandemic, felt that the nation was at a historical low point.
Right.
That paints kind of a stark picture, I think, of those pre-existing levels of stress and worry that people were carrying around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we get to the pandemic.
Yeah.
And things really, understandably, anxiety levels skyrocketed.
Right.
The statistics that are cited, from China and the U.S. showing these really dramatic increases in reported anxiety and psychological distress. I mean, it's pretty sobering.
Right.
It is.
So what is going on in our brains?
Yeah.
Why are we so prone to this? Let's delve into the machinery of worry, so to speak.
Right. Okay. So that brings us to the role of the brain in all this, and specifically the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. So this is kind of like, you think of your brain, it's the newest, most sophisticated part of of your brain. It's right behind your forehead.
Mm-hmm.
And this area is involved in all sorts of, higher level functioning, creativity, planning, and crucially, predicting the future.
Okay, so it's like our internal simulation machine.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Based on past experiences,
Okay, what's coming next? What's coming next?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But the PFC needs accurate information to make these predictions.
Right.
And when information is lacking, which was certainly the case, the early days of COVID,
Yeah.
with so much uncertainty.
Right. Nobody knew what was going on.
Nobody knew what was going on. Exactly. So the PFC can actually start running, fear-based simulations.
Right.
Imagining worst-case scenarios.
Right.
And because, our brains tend to remember, shocking, fear-inducing news more vividly, they can really create this a big heap of badness for the brain to process.
Oh, yeah.
So, uncertainty really, really fuels anxiety.
It's like the uncertainty itself is the fuel.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this idea of acute learning. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what's the significance of that?
Yeah. So acute learning is really this rapid association that our brains make after escaping danger.
Mm.
So think about like almost stepping into traffic.
Right.
That really intense fear that you feel in that moment, it creates this very strong link between, stepping in the street without looking and, potential harm.
Right.
So it's a very efficient survival mechanism.
Makes sense. Yeah. It's like our bodies need to release that pent up energy.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Like the zebras, they shake after, escaping the lions.
Yeah.
Like they have to discharge that adrenaline.
Right.
That's important. That's how we avoid getting, chronic stress.
Right. So now let's fast forward to our information saturated world.
Right.
We're exposed to, huge volumes of information every day, often contradictory or even misleading.
Yeah.
How does that impact our anxiety?
So it creates something that researchers have labeled choice overload.
Okay.
We're being exposed to so much information and so much choice. And that increases the uncertainty. Our brains really don't like uncertainty.
Right. It can be very overwhelming. Like even just trying to, wade through Google search results, or keep up with, a bottomless social media feed.
Right. It's like, it's too much. It's like drinking out of a fire hose,
It's too much for our brains to process.
It's too much.
It's like that, that tidal wave analogy. It's just like, it's just coming at you all the time. So instead of just seeking more and more information, what's the alternative? What do we do instead?
Right. So I think the key here is to develop these reliable tools for working with our emotions rather than just endlessly searching for external answers.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately anxiety is often stemming from internal experiences.
Right.
It's not necessarily just what's happening out in the world. So we need internal skills, not just external information.
Mm-hmm. And this leads into this idea that you're addicted to something, which might sound a little jarring at first.
Yeah.
But the author is using addiction in a broader sense.
Yeah. He expands the definition of addiction beyond just, substances, drugs, alcohol, to really anything where there's this continued use despite adverse consequences. So think about, things like excessive shopping or constantly checking social media,
right,
or even, repetitive worrying.
Yep.
These can all fall into that definition, if they're having this negative impact on your life.
Right.
So addiction isn't just about, drugs and alcohol. It can be any behavior that we keep doing,
right,
even when it's hurting us.
And it seems like the modern world is almost designed to foster these kinds of addictive experiences.
Totally.
With all the convenience and efficiency that we have.
Totally. It's like we're surrounded by these 2-minute, 2-click fixes.
Right.
So it's so easy to just kind of engage in these impulsive behaviors without really considering, the longer term costs and benefits.
Right.
And things like clickbait headlines, and those carefully engineered features on all these apps.
Right.
They're all designed to kind of create that itch and keep us hooked.
Yeah. They're tapping into this very primal part of our brain. Right. Which brings us to this idea of reward-based learning.
Right. Sure.
And this concept of the old brain.
So the old brain, think of this as the more primitive parts of your brain that are primarily focused on survival.
Right.
And a key mechanism for survival is reward-based learning.
Okay.
So we do more of what feels good. That's called positive reinforcement.
Right.
We do less of what feels bad. That's negative reinforcement.
Right.
This is a very fundamental learning process. It's seen even in very, very simple organisms like sea slugs.
Okay.
So our brains are really wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Right.
And that really drives a lot of our habits.
Yeah. How about how does intermittent reinforcement play into this? Because that sounds like something that, you hear about those apps and casinos using.
Totally.
Yeah.
So intermittent reinforcement is where rewards are given, unpredictably. And it's a very, very powerful way to maintain habits. Think about like slot machines.
Right.
They don't pay out every time.
Right.
But they pay out just enough to keep people playing.
Right. Right. Keep you coming back for more.
Exactly. And so similarly, like those unpredictable alerts from our phones, right?
Right.
Like a new email, a social media notification, it triggers this response in our old brain.
Yeah.
And the old brain doesn't really, distinguish between a potentially dangerous threat and a non-urgent notification.
Right. It's like it doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and a late-night email.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So, unpredictable rewards are very effective at keeping us engaged in these habits.
It's like our ancient survival brain has not caught up with the modern world.
No, it hasn't. Not at all.
Yeah.
And the immediate availability of things now also bypasses this thoughtful consideration of costs and benefits that we used to have.
Right. So back in the day, if you wanted something, it often involved, time and effort.
Right.
You had to go out, you had to, hunt or gather or whatever.
Yeah.
And that gave you a chance to really think about, like, do I really need this?
Right.
Is this worth it?
Yeah.
Or do I want to just stay in my cave?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we have instant gratification at our fingertips.
Right.
Those impulsive behaviors, they're much, much easier to act on. And when we're stressed, when we're anxious, that cave person brain, that old brain, it kicks in. It wants to seek that immediate comfort, that immediate reward of feeling less anxious, even if it's just temporary.
Right.
Which
brings us to the worry cycle, which sounds like a bit of a trap that I think many of us fall into.
Yeah.
So what does that mean, the worry cycle?
So, an unpleasant emotion, can trigger worry as a mental behavior. It's almost like a way to distract ourselves or feel a sense of control.
Right.
But the problem is, when that reward of distraction fades, or fails to really deliver, then the worry itself can trigger more anxiety. So it creates this self-perpetuating feedback loop.
Right.
So worry itself, can be a habit that actually feeds anxiety.
So worry can become a habit even if there isn't like a specific thing that we're worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes anxiety just arises. There's not a clear trigger. There's no object to the anxiety.
Right.
But then that anxious feeling itself, kicks off the worrying. It's almost like the mind is trying to find something to be anxious about.
Right.
So we have this anxiety triggering anxiety loop, and that can be really, really hard to break if you don't recognize its habitual nature.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've kind of mapped out the problem a little bit. So what's a first step towards change? This first gear that you mentioned.
Right. So first gear is all about becoming aware of these habit loops.
Okay.
It's about identifying, the triggers, the behaviors, and the rewards.
Right.
That are keeping these cycles going. So he gives some examples like, anxiety leading to drinking as a way of numbing.
Right.
Or anxiety about work leading to procrastination. That's avoidance.
Right.
So for you, the listener, this means starting to notice, the patterns in your own anxiety and your own habits.
Right. That story about John quitting drinking just by mapping his anxiety loops is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
It really shows how just, bringing awareness to those patterns can sometimes lead to pretty significant change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like just seeing the loop can be enough to start to break it.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes.
Right.
But it's important to note, there's a warning here. So after you map these loops, there's a temptation to immediately try to, fix them using those, old ineffective strategies.
It's like, you go to the mechanic, they lift up the hood of your car. They're like, okay, here's what's wrong.
Right.
And you're like, well, I'm just going to reach in there and start, messing around with stuff.
Right.
Yeah. You might make it worse.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
So first gear, that intellectual understanding of how these habits form and how they play out, that's really about building momentum.
Right.
For the later stages of change.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the wax on, wax off.
Right.
Yeah. It might seem menial,
Right.
but it's laying the foundation for the real effective action that comes later.
So changing habits, it's not as simple as just, deciding to change, right? Like
Yeah.
what makes it so difficult to break these patterns?
Right. So the traditional approach often involves, willpower and repetition.
Right.
He talks about this Yale medical student
Mm-hmm.
smoking cessation lecture where the focus was just on repeating these phrases,
Right.
And while repetition plays a role in forming habits, this forceful approach is often not very effective for breaking unwanted ones.
Right.
So willpower alone
Right.
is often not enough to break these ingrained habits.
It sounds like changing habits takes more than just, memorization.
Yeah.
It requires like engaging with the underlying storyline, so to speak,
Right.
of our own
Yeah.
habits.
Yeah.
And that's where, mind mapping comes in.
Right. So diligently outlining, those habit loops,
Right.
the triggers, your reactions, and what you get out of them.
Okay.
This might feel like menial labor,
Right.
but it's actually it's critical for your hero's journey of habit change.
Okay.
So
So we've become aware of our habits.
yeah,
What's happening in our brains as those habits become, really ingrained.
right. So our old brain, that survival focused part,
Right.
it really likes to move, those learned behaviors into muscle memory.
Okay.
As quickly as possible, and this frees up cognitive resources.
Right.
In the newer parts of our brain, like the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
So we can focus on learning new things.
It's efficient.
It's efficient.
Right.
Totally.
The brain is trying to be efficient.
Yeah. You can imagine if you had to like relearn how to tie your shoes every morning.
Right. Right.
You'd be exhausted.
Right. You wouldn't get anything done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So habits are in a way, it's your brain being efficient.
Right. But then you've got this prefrontal cortex, the new brain, which is responsible for thinking, planning, controlling urges, right? So that's where the conflict arises, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
The old brain's like, I just want that donut.
Right. Yeah. It's scarcity mode.
Gotta get the donut.
Yeah. Got to get the donut. I need to hoard those toilet paper rolls.
Right.
All this stuff.
Right.
Whereas the new brain is like, that rational voice that says, well, hold on a second.
Right. Maybe not.
Do you really need that?
Right.
And the problem is, the PFC is kind of the puny part of the brain.
Right. Relatively speaking.
Right. It's weak,
So willpower is kind of weak.
Yeah. Willpower is not
Yeah. Especially under stress.